to commence this year. We conceive these seminars as signature events that advance our thinking on Africa and African studies. The seminars are also part of the Africa Multiple Cluster of Excellence, whose mandate is to advance the agenda of reconfiguring African studies. And as such, the seminars are also part of our regular Knowledge Lab keynote events organized around questions of methodological innovations, theoretical innovations, and reflexive African studies. In the conceptualization of these seminar series, we were informed by the idea of rethinking and even unthinking Africa itself as an idea, a concept, a place, and many other iterations at a time of insurgent and resurgent decolonization of the 21st century as a necessary departure point in the agenda of reconfiguring African studies. The inaugural seminar was delivered by Professor Achille Mbembe, a research professor at the Wits Institute of Social and Economic Research, the WISER, at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg in South Africa on 21st of April. In the inaugural seminar, Professor Achille Mbembe grappled with the pertinent issue of Africa in theory. The second seminar was delivered by Professor Eliso Makamo, a professor of sociology and African studies at the University of Basel in Switzerland. And the title of his seminar was Sovereign Reason, Issues in African Studies, held on 25 May. Today's seminar is given by an eminent and distinguished African scholar who has done so much for African studies and African history and does not need too much introduction. Suffice to say, he is a renowned historian, university distinguished teaching professor, and the Jacob and Sanger Mosika Chair in the Humanities at the University of Texas at Austin in the United States. Professor Falula's topic for today is From Pan-Africanism to Afro-Futurism, Trajectories of African Liberation Ideas.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And I told the organizers that I'm having internet issues. So I pray that I'm able to at least finish the lecture. It's a long one, it's like 40 pages. It's just written for this purpose. And I will introduce it with 4 elements. Issues around genealogies of liberationist ideas, which are anchored to movements. And what I did in the paper is to link the oldest with the newest. And there are those that are in between them. If you look at those genealogies from the 19th century, first half of the 20th century, they deal with epistemologies of self-assertion. So all of writings by Blyden and his successor, and Garvey and Du Bois, these were genealogies of self-assertion. And in the library of that self-assertion is around the definition of Africanity, is saying that my internet connection is unstable. So then comes the ideas on liberation, Africanist liberation, tied to a wide range of development, tied to a wide range of new ideas on planning, both academic and in practical terms. Now, if you fuse both, you find a combination of organic scholars and non-organic intellectuals. Sometimes we conflate both, but we have to disentangle them. And third, although these movements are separated in time, my argument is that the context shares several similarities. and they are products of the mind in the humanities and in the sciences. They all deal with race uplift, solutions to serious problems. The question to pose as we revive many of these conversations is, can we build an Africanized future on a colonized structure? And that's the way I will frame this series as we move towards its end, that we have to answer that serious question. If the argument is that the structures are colonized, how do we cumulate our own challenges and answer the question, can you construct an Africanized future on a colonized structure? And it's a problematic. I will leave the humanities aside and focus on the sciences. And the reason why I'm focusing on the sciences is because that is the frontier of Afro-Futurism. But I will connect it to the other ideas that science is old. You can say technology is newer. So from the Stone Age, you are dealing with science. So that science has always been there, but we've not fully studied those various dimensions. The Pan-Africanists' reduction of all on the same pedestal of human ability, mind and imagination, meant that the science fiction we talk about today as a forecast to the future of the world could be conceived in the Black mind, in anybody's mind. In the Nogora, actually Mbebe made a point that you can study the world from any part of the world. I remember that sentence very correctly. That once you admit that science has always been there since the Stone Age, and we can trace it, the dynamics of many of these arguments have to shift. And that's why I am avoiding the usual trope of negritude, things like that. In other words, I want to confront this idea of science head on and weave it to the narrative. The Africanness of these scientific imaginations, which have always been there, in newer forms from Greg Tate, Kodoueshun, Tricia Rose, McDerry, they assume that, we tend to assume that they are new, but my argument is that they are not, that these imaginations have always been there. One example, the fourth Alaafin of Oyo, by the name of Shango, it's an entire project, both of science and of scientific imagination. In all mythologies, all stories, all agreed that it could emit fire, that it could ask rain to fall. If you connect it to how modern disciplines. Can you hear me? Keep talking.
Yes, we can. We can hear you.
If you take that idea and move to 2022, you find that imagination, say of Shango, and imaginations of those who write on science fictions, they are not dissimilar. The interface is there. Advances in technology have expanded those imaginative ideas, but they are not new as we are presenting it. So there are sciences that you could disappear, you could protect yourself from gunshots. All the Zulu Empire, Yoruba Empire, all of them had what they characterize as magic, not science, doing that. that you could actually move from Lagos to Germany without taking a plane. You just wish it, you conjure it, and you will land in Berlin. All these ideas have not been cumulated and evaluated for larger meanings. So in contemporary Afro-Futurism, it says it's speculative fiction that connects itself to technology. And more generally, I'm quoting Derry here, and more generally, signification that appropriates images of technology and prophetically enhanced future. I can go to Akan in the 18th century and plug that quotation into it. Whether it's in the area of science, and today, as they rebirth this orientation in many parts of Africa, witchcraft in South Africa, money for ritual in Nigeria, because for you to conceive that you can use human parts to make money, that is a scientific imagination. And if you ask for the proof of it, just as you are asking for the proof of Afro-Futurism, you may hit a wall. The current conceptualization is an assertion that Africans, Black people are capable of scientific progress, yes. Whether a far-reaching assumption or a reality based on logic and its sequence is conceivable, my argument is that it is not going to be surprising in an African context. If you say you are standing to evaluate the future and progressive thematic conceptions in relation to Black cultural production and the relationship and changes that technology and innovation are bringing, then you are assuming that you can connect African culture to Afro-Futurism, and you can create a blueprint for innovations and developmentalism. So Afro-Futurism builds on hope for resolving many African problems like security challenges that have proved notorious enough to survive several attempts and periods, the African economy that is going down the drain, enhancing development, creating affordable solutions in public health, and more. For Africa, Afro-Futurism is beyond how science and the laws of physics that decide what can be become deified to give space for possibility. As it talks about the future, especially in the works of Butler, James, Red Wolf, Kai Ashanti Wilson, Tomi Adeyemi, who's born in my city, who wrote Children of Blood and Bone, you begin to see the pace for acknowledgement of the unending abilities of African and Black people to constructively create ideas that draw from their own heritage and identity and connect them to many of the previous movements. It is that connection to many of the previous movements that are missing in the literature. And this is how I'm going to connect it. I will argue that Pan-Africanism is telling us that the stage is set. Some people argue that Pan-Africanism is dead, that it fulfilled its mission and faded off. But I'm revising the argument, not around death, but around setting a stage. Afro-Futurism tells us unimaginable things that stage could be used for. This is my new argument. So instead of saying negritude is dead and Pan-Africanism is dead, I am revisiting this argument and saying Afro-Futurism is connected to a stage that has been set. And what do I mean by that? In setting this stage, they've given us enormous ideas on identity, on Black heritage. They've argued that there was no deficiency in Black intelligence. And that point is very important. Whether it's Du Bois or Blyden, they said, we cannot accept the notion of around IQ, which became accentuated some decades back. And they proved that sufficiently. And Pan-African writers and scholars corrected the notion of inferiority. I look no further than Du Bois. Of all races, W.B. Du Bois was the preeminent intellectual of the last century. Go and look, create a catalog of names. He will be top 1% there, diminishing the idea of this inferiority. And very calmly, they argue for equality of Africa and Black people in every sense of the human right. They condemn discrimination. They campaign fully for the right of territorial and mental independence of Africa. And as they argued, they began to say the point that one civilization is greater than another, we should dismiss that idea. In saying Africa for Africans, people like Garvey, Senghor, they do not mean that Africa should be an isolated estate where all is done exclusively within it. So you find Afro-Futurism also making the point that Blackness, Africanity can be linked and connected to location is not a new idea. Reread Du Bois, Africa and the world and Africa, and you begin to see how he has anticipated some of the arguments in Afro-Futurism that we package as new. Pan-Africanism posits that there should always be a taste of Africanism in such developmental endeavors, despite doing them with the adoption of foreign methodologies and languages. The work of Senghor to Du Bois, they were very clear on this idea. The freedom of expansion of knowledge conceived with African epistemology and conception allowed the adoption of the science fictional ideas for the portrayal of Africa in science, innovation, technology, and all areas that are material to societal development. It means that the widest imagination, or any imagination at all, is not distant from the minds of Africa. That thread has been there. That thread has been there. The Pan-Africanist movement for equality in science, technology, research, and human conceptions in general has allowed different ideas, discoveries, and conclusions to be reached in the Black world since the 19th century. What is the interconnection between Pan-Africanism and Afro-Futurism? And I'm trying to emphasize this point because the arguments disconnect both of them. The argument tends to see Afro-Futurism as a standalone, sometimes disconnected from previous movement. And here's my argument. Pan-Africanism portrays the readiness of the African continent and Black people to recognize their shared history, a destiny that is unique, formation of cross-cultural unity in all sectors of the society, and the collective hope for a desired future of the Black race with a mindset of self-sufficiency and capacity. The impact of Pan-Africanism through its conferences and engagement created an open mind. And in that open mind, most of these writers, whether it's Nkrumah or Azikiwe, were thinking in terms of what I call the assurance of possibilities. That's my phrase, assurance of possibilities. And it was on these assurances that those who fought for independence, the freedom for all Black race, the need to stop discrimination, grounded their theoretical platform. And these assurances allowed them to fight for independence, participate in abolition, create confidence, and talk about development. And these assurances inspired people across the world to question the status quo. And you find this in various meetings, in various writings of earlier movements. The Afro-Futurists came from a background similar to the Pan-Africanist assurances. That argument may become contested, and it can be challenged, but I will cumulate them. That older movements and newer ones, their assurances to antagonize the intellectual historical characters attributed to Black people. Afro-Futurism unearths the contemporary attributes of inventions and their possible futures to put Africans in that context and showcase that Africans have the power to achieve more of those now and in the future. Afro-Futurism creates an African future industry that is based on the control and prediction of the future, in which Africa is not exempt and might be the center of such development. Pan-Africanism started out as a foundation for removing the fogs of limitation, and Afro-Futurism extends to freedom, sustaining that freedom to possible exploration beyond our imagination. So I see a cross similarity between the beginning of Pan-Africanism and Afro-Futurism in the fashion in which both emerged. The sweats of Africans and Blacks in the diaspora form the coming together of similar minds to agree on Pan-Africanist agenda. And what you find in the newer movement is also, in many ways, similar to that. When science fiction emerged, it started by taking the world as one race and blinded to the possible future for Black people and not Black people. There was an unconscious assumption of the absence of the Black people in the prediction of the future of science and the world as a whole. When the world envisioned the settlement in the solar system, the sciences on the moon, creation of new cities in Mars, high-sense robotics, genetic mutilations, and environmental advancement, Africa was not in these projections. You won't find them in this projection. It was either as a result of unbelievable advancement of the continent to reach that level at the time predicted on an awkward, unconscious belief. This projection and visions do not belong to the continent. Bear in mind, they must also counter these arguments. So, in the genealogy of science fiction, as it emerged until Black intervention, we are not going to see a Black-oriented Star Wars, Man of Steel, African Superman or Spider-Man, among other science fictional characters. The high-tech warships and technological concepts meant for the future have not been adapted to reflect African possibilities. Rather, they challenge our ability in terms of intelligence. As such, it seemed like the initial white conception of civilization that brought about European dominance in the past, that Pan-Africanism tried to battle unconsciously, failed the prediction of the future. I'm connecting the argument about the dark continent of the 19th century with the initial assumption that in the technologies that have cataloged, Africa was erased. It's another form of the dark continent in the science world, with biases, characteristics that dominated the imagination of the future from the perspective of a science fiction. The best imagination of Africans in the future through science fiction, in the early stage of science fiction, you will find in Graph 16 collections of stories in Human and Other Beings, 1963, where the works of Lee Brackett, Ray Bradbury, George Eliot, Mark Reynolds, Robert Sheckley, Evelyn Smith, Robert Banks, McIntosh, Ten, and many others were collected. However, just 1/3 of these works and stories addressed African Americans with full concentration and directness, and only 3 of them incorporated Black characters from African futures. And I'm saying this so that you can put Afro-Futurism and the science-based in context. These writers and other Afro-Futurists from the early stage to the contemporary time refused to allow Black exclusion, the newer ones, from the future, and as such stood as encouragement for Africanism in science fiction. That is, just as the Pan-Africanist writers challenged notions of European domination and the dark continent, Afro-Futurists also did a similar challenge in a newer area. And you can track the ideas behind philosophies behind Pan-Africanism, which was the quest to rediscover and recount African identity in every instance. Pan-Africanists inspired the resurfacing of African values in politics, education, social construct. And aside from the discovery of these values, they tended to allow Africans to be conscious of associating with these identities. This idea of African identity is what is carried on by Afro-future writers to portray these identities. And the infusion of African identity in science fiction creates a bond between the two concepts and the similarity of purpose. I know that this idea may be challenged. When they refer to the term in its view of Black to the future, it could be viewed as an admission of these identities into the future of science and a new society. These identities, as portrayed, are now embraced by contemporary writers that non-Africans and non-Blacks have been exploring the African identities in their fiction, as in the work of the Black Panther. The meeting point between Pan-Africanism and Afro-Futurism expresses the desires of Africans and the Black race for development and vision of Africa in the future. Pan-Africanists state that Africa should be respected in terms of its past and history, and also fight that Africa should be the center of development in the continent, and that the position of the continent, among others, should be treated equally. That statement you find in the works of Nkrumah and Azikwe and many others. However, Afro-Futurism leaps a little further. They recognize the appreciation of African abilities in the present in order to form an opinion on their capacity of science conceptions. But they chiefly assert that Africa and the Black race should not be excluded from a projection into the future. It means that Africa and Black people have the capacity to imagine, although fictionally, the future of the elite and advance the approach to them. When we say from Pan-Africanism to Afro-Futurism, we say it is time to think of the future with Africanistic eyes. And what is their possibility? Well, it includes arts and music and literature and scholarly works that envision Africa in the future of science and development and their interaction with technoculture now and in the future. Afrofuturism could be held to address three different issues cogent to the Black society, and this is my reading of them. First, to give a narration of science and technology from an imaginary perspective and an intertwine of African characteristics. Second, to harness and recover Black history with the aim of using them to examine how they influence the Black culture in the present. And third, to inquire into how the recovered and harnessed culture can be inspiration for new ideas and visions for the future. Consequently, Afrofuturist writers tend to create a link between the past and the imagination of the future, which is what Pan-Africanists like Du Bois did, by drawing up many of these cultural and historical materials in every scientific discussion and fiction that have been created. So you find many works, Kodro, Esun, and many others to illustrate this point. One way Afrofuturists have been able to redefine the future of the African continent has been the use of literature in fictional and scientific portrayal of the future. These pieces of literature have been able to link African society with the projected future and this of reality without the out-of-space particularism of the movies and videos. Even without visual depiction, Afrofuturism imagines the development of the African vocabularies to express concepts and materials that are either scientific or not within the range of linguistics operation in Africa and among basic languages of Black people. They create local words or words that look African to depict these concepts and thus arrive at a forecast of the recognition of those concepts in a manner that was so normal that there are alternative native words for them in Africa. The fact that many of these linguistic resources have not been available in the language bodies of the continent has been one of the excuses used by science fictional writers to exclude the continent from the future. But the new writers have been able to survey these situations and reconceptualize these ideas fitting with African ideologies. The development of language is also seen in the way cultural concepts are used to portray current or futuristic ideas. You could see this in Sonra's avant-garde musical composition, which is orchestral bands. He created an intertwine of science, culture, myth, and language, depicting himself as the Egyptian sun god, mixing the solar system terms with African concepts and envisioning the Blacks and the space. And aside from the creation of the right words, for every bit of imagination by writers and musicians of Afrofuturism, there's a linguistic courage that influences their creations to set these works apart from the traditional science fiction and prediction of the future. Similar to these accomplishments, the act of Africanizing such writing is Pan-Africanistic, and therefore a reenactment of this push for the development and independence of the African language, but only in a futuristic manner. Afro-Futurism has the characteristics of exploring magical realism in a bid to portray comic or scientific characters that attributes beyond the normal order of things. Post-colonial African writers have keyed severally into this aspect of literature. Magical realism as a type of Afro-Futurism is made easy by the use of African mythology and oral traditions. It is easy to build a story that will portray unbelievable powers, genetic elements, and scientific manipulations that distort nature to create imagination. And the existence of these African attributes made it not impossible for Afro-Futurist imaginations that put Africa in context. In essence, the imaginative future of an Afro-Futurist writer and that of an African magical realism writer means a lot in the solidification of the future and the achievement of its possibilities. It shows a justification for the attempt to include Africa in the discussion of imagined future without being discouraged by the colonial stories of African limitations. Let us agree, you and I, in the imagination of Afro-Futurists and the tomorrow that we see, and do not exclude Africans and Black people. Do we really believe that when these futuristic developments, even if they are not in the exact manners of their predictions, would Africa predicted involvement be a true representation of what will be obtainable by that time? This question has become necessary, seeing that future developments are often the point of logical lines drawn from the past. I will return to this idea in the conclusion. Another possibility that favors the envisioning of Africa in exotic future is the evidence of the past discoveries and achievements of the continent in history, especially the long pre-colonial period. Africa developed its own methods of agric. They built their own technologies. They constructed their own infrastructure. And they built their own empires, built their own institutions. They built huge structures, starting with the pyramids that we always quote. And it's notable for its ancient medical systems. And many of the claims about medicine, some of them are wrong with respect to herbs and plants. Africans discovered advanced transportation and navigation systems that helped them move within and outside cities. There have been records of navigation and so many other examples. And through history, it is obvious that Pan-Africanist claim of Africa being able to achieve self-subsistence based on their history, cultural heritage, and internal resources are true. I mean, the achievements of African societies in a way that has touched the whole world are enough muse for such determination and agitation that saw colonial domination and Eurocentric influence embarrassing to the continent. Afro-Futurists saw that it would be wrong to leave the imagination of the future to an Hegelian bias that strips Africa out of the discussions. When we envision the future without African materials, it is either it does not exist or we do not have a clear view of that future. These various achievements are enough encouragement for Afro-Futurists and Africans to believe that the future can be Africanized. If science in the past was a possibility for Africans, science in the future, whether real or mere intuition, is a possibility for Africans. The creations of the Afro-Futurists do not only end in technological advancement predicted for the African future, it also encompasses a change in the social order for a more sophisticated system than what is operated in the present dispensation. Ordinarily, it posits the exploration of science and technology and their influence on social constructs. A change in educational system with high-tech materials and studies, transportation with probably teleportation, politics with a different approach, a booming economy or one that has a touch of the future, and many other social changes. Although Afro-Futurism tries to retain African cultural materials in future predictions, it might be a counter-creation of the African cultural values. There is no certainty whether this future holds collective or individualistic social orientation in the new era they try to imagine. The expectation of a new trend of social deviance have been expressed by different Afro-Futurist writers, as seen in Aye and Gomorrah by Samuel Delany, where he depicted the interplay of different sexualities and the space of cure from the approach of Afro-Futurism. If you ask me, the possibility of an African future and change in social orientation to current trends across the world in African future, the current trend and rate of increase will not give me the confidence that such sexuality will not be identical in African future. And this does not in any way show my own position of those orientations. And you can find other issues that they have to deal with, that they're dealing with, women and patriarchy, feminist approaches, as in fledgling by Butler, and many other ideas. The international and global community is controlled by countries with progressive developments, technological advancement, military powers, and historical supremacy. These characteristics were those that provided permanent seats for France, China, Russia, and England, the US, in the UN. This advancement allowed the effrontery to go to war with weapons capable of destroying people. A utopian Africa posits African countries as a center of attraction for international bodies and countries to depend on technologies fashioned from African cultures, social values, and intelligence. It posits seeing African currency as a standard for world trade and economy, the annexing of its agricultural resources to build nations. Afro-Futurism puts Africa at the center of discoveries and most current trends in the future and looks beyond its greatest challenges in the contemporary world. In the global science fiction cultures, future imaginations and predictions often do not take account of African peculiarities and the abilities of the Blacks in the early stage of its development. However, it is obvious that Blacks have taken over science fiction to build African superhumans and envision scientific impossibilities. One thing that distinguishes Afro-Futurism from other global community prediction is its Pan-Africanist infusion of Afrocentric qualities and attributes that make it qualify as Afro-Futuristic in the first place. It projects the qualities of the continent and makes a predictive statement that African heritage could push it to the top of the world and that it could decide the fate of the global space with the assertiveness of the European explorers and exploiters. In other words, what Mungo Park and Stanley did as explorers in Africa, the new writers are doing the same, the explorers of new ideas of discovery. Putting aside the fictional overreaching characteristics of these protagonists, the question is whether or not Africa can have a respectable space in a global future. This question is born out of the current challenges and predicaments. We know what Africa will be in the future, according to Afro-Futurists. But the question that this variable should make is to ask, in what role will it be in the future? And following the sequence of development without variables and probabilities bring radical and unpredictable change for Africa to hold a reasonable role. The first point of call is to refocus much attention on research, science, and technology in order to increase the possibilities and odds of a respectable role in the future. What are the limitations of this new thinking? The limitations of Afro-Futurism. When Pan-Africanist dreams were conceived, they envisioned an Africa that would be independent and facilitate development. These dreams emphasized a smooth economy after the belief in the attainment of colonial independence and achievement of African unity. If we look at all the writings in the 1950s, the belief was Africa would attain economy, would attain development. And these dreams go into all sectors of the society, and they are purged from colonial and Eurocentric entrampments. Remember, by the 50s, Nkrumah was building a nuclear program in Ghana. While many of these dreams have not been achieved, and the dreams are still alive, political instability and economic challenge created their problems. If Pan-Africanism, which is now becoming more theoretical in nature, is facing setbacks, what would Afro-Futuristic aspirations be like? What is the problem of all these movements share similarities? The challenges facing the realities of Afro-Futurism are far greater. And that is a debate we can have. And while I talk about this aspiration, I do not mean those entertaining spices to Afro-Futurist accounts. The first challenge, I think, is the core feature of the ideology itself. The fictional creations of esoteric characters without possibilities and aimed to entertain might make one lose the focus of the depictions of these writers. Many of these aspirations and ideologies are born out of the urge to express imaginative freedom and might require scientific explanation and possibilities. No possibilities can be disposed of. Laws and theories are made and counted at the same time. The word which was once believed to be plain was refuted long after. Hence, these aspirations might be true. We, however, should not be buried in the possibilities of those aspirations, even in their overreaching manners. But we can concentrate on the message of hope that Afro-Futurism preaches. And bear in mind, that message of hope you find in Blinding, you find in Gave, you find in Negritude movement, you find in Nkrumah. Can Africa ever reach the level of development portrayed by Afro-Futurist writers? Would there be a point where a high level of nanotechnology is applicable to all parts of the society to make life easier? And one impediment is the current state of the continent itself, increasing underdevelopment, military coups and military rule. Sometimes they may cast a doubt on the possibilities of achieving the aspirations of Afro-Futurism. And bear in mind, if you look at earlier movements, these doubts were there. When people were talking in previous movements about the pyramids, they were being challenged that if you could build the pyramids, why are you not able to build roads and build gutters in the new world? There will come a time when Afro-Futurists will also be challenged along that line. The foundation of Afro-Futurism is science fiction. And the foundation of science fiction is science itself. This means that scientific and technological advancement are ingredients to Afro-Future discussions. With the current state of science and technology in Africa being a problem on its own, it is only a few African countries that can invest in research, science, and technology. And where there are no scientific studies and technological innovation, Africa may not be able to attain a respectable position. And the argument will now become a disconnect between reality and Afro-Futurism. One thing is to have a vision of development, but another is a legitimate query as to whether or not the society will be ready for these developments to materialize. Is Afro-Futurist developmental policy, as it should now be perceived in this global village, possible without a cultural reimagining, reinvention, and reorientation of a number of issues, including population dynamics? It's a question we have to pose and connect to the past. And in connecting it to the past, one best example is juju in Africa. What we call juju in its various forms are products of great imaginations. They believe that you can manipulate objects to create the future, to reimagine your society, to fast forward. When South Africa was under apartheid, it was not a joke when a former head of state by the name of Obasanjo said, why don't you bring all the juju men and women together and they should make apartheid disappear? That query reinvented as a project of Afro-Futurism also take that dimension. That you're talking about science in terms of its imagination, but the boundary of its reality is shrinking. So let us expect those challenges to come. Let me now close. And I'm happy the internet has cooperated. There's no one who does not want to think good of himself or herself, as everyone has an expectation of a favorable future and condition. This is the hope that is inherited from Afro-Future works. The same hope that we inherited from negritude ideas, the same hope that we inherited from scholars, organized scholars of the 19th century. The global depiction of the future has been criticized and made to Africa in it, and this has been reenacted severally by brilliant minds. the infusion of Black cultures has shown evidence of the continuation of the Pan-Africanist orientation and the advancement of the ideology to practical aspirations towards the future. It is obvious that one of the many reasons why Africa has been exempted from the initial discussion of the possible future was to base ideas on their present level of development and readiness to transform as exhibited in various aspects of African societies. This may be true assuming if we must move from the ideological position of Pan-Africanism to a practical depiction of the future, there's a need for Africa to harness its resources in such a way that we'll be able to become self-sufficient and boost developmental strategies to a realistic world. In addition, with the current trend of globalization and its influence on every part of the world, it is quite definite that there is almost no society that will not draw one or two values, resources, innovations from it to keep up with the needs and changing social behavior. Citizens of every country are fast becoming citizens of the world with flexible visa policies, free market and trade, social media and internet access, among many other tools that globalization uses to spread its tentacles across the world. These factors have made it impossible to draw barriers against the trend and as such, made it a necessity. The reason why there's a link between Afro-Futurism and globalization is there was a link between the older ideas with colonization is the continuous diffusion of ideas and innovations that facilitate development and widen the scope of imagination and strategy of every societies towards development. Africa is not going to stand in isolation in this present world, and as such, a future for every nation includes their gains from the interaction with other countries and their connection to their own past. The core principles of modern decolonization and desist from further colonization. We can desist from the discoveries made in other parts of the world. If globalization tends to aid development and Afro-Futurism, we stand to all benefit. How then can we sustain the question I started with as a problematic, and I want to close with it? How then can we sustain an Africanized future in the face of the radicality of globalization and its changes? Go back to the 19th century. How could the African nations sustain their sovereignty in the face of the radicality of European conquest? How can one not fulfill the prophecies of early science fiction, where their depictions are to be real and where they erased Africans in it? Go back to colonial Africa to the 19th century. How could the prophecies of Garvey and Du Bois, how could they have worked? How could they have been translated into reality? One way is to fulfill the agenda of Pan-Africanism now and carry the ideologies to the future. African countries and the continent at large make sure that there's a continuous injection of African values and reenactment in every bit of globalization processes, platforms, and efforts across all sectors of respective societies. globalization cannot be excused, but it can be Africanized. Just as Africans represented an agency that Africanized many elements of colonial regimes. In addition, there's a need for continuous decolonization of every sector. This is because our societies, science and research and technologies are built on a colonial and Eurocentric methodology that might not be favorable to the African identity. It's impossible for a child not to share the DNA of his parents, except there's a justifiable scientific exception. It is also possible to build an Africanized future on a colonized structure. It would mean, I argue, building a colonized future. To resolve this, we must endeavor to take seriously the core principles of modern decolonization and prevent further colonization. Pan-Africanism might be different, and I will agree with those who see it as different, although I've argued that it is not. It might address the present and past, and we might wish to move from it to a beautiful future. But an underlying idea behind Afro-Futurism is Pan-Africanism. And many of you will disagree with this. I will respect your opinion. Where Pan-Africanism set the stage, this is my last sentence, where Pan-Africanism set the stage and ideas of Afrocentrism and Africanization, Afro-Futurism takes them further to build a desirable depiction of the future. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Falola, for a very wonderful and thought-provocative lecture. Thank you. Colleagues, we'll do what we have done in the previous lectures. If colleagues have questions, comments, it is open. I see some of you have already started commenting on the chat. So, I mean, if you have a question or a comment, you can raise your hand and we take it from. Maybe while we are waiting for that, Professor Falola, we should just check the comment here from Lucky Malulek, who says, so it seems the divide and rule is still working now, even facilitated by ourselves as Africans. I mean, he had started earlier with a general question that it seems that Africa and Africans want equality, but other continents or countries seek dominance, and Africa is always mostly dominated, and Africans suffer in the process. Why can't Africa seek dominance over other continents or countries as well? Maybe thinking.
So let me take that on the chart.
Yes.
So that binary of domination is true. And it's also true that this is one of the continents that has not presented itself as seeking to dominate others. When you leave aspects of internal colonization and internal domination, but also had to that point that even in spite of suffering, some people have argued that the anger is not enough, that the anger does not have depth. But what Afro-Futurism is now saying within the realm of science fiction is that that dominance is possible, and that the continent can also escape being dominated. Remember, in Dubai, Africa and the World and Africa, Senghor, they all praise the very fact of not seeking to dominate other people. So that what they bothered with was, how do you now meet the challenges of that domination, not how you would set out to dominate other people. The second question by Flambeau, the comment, is related to the first in terms of illicit resource flow, the abundance of raw materials, the fact of inability to unite, which was the call Pan-Africanism that led to the creation of the Organization of African Unity and subsequently African Union. If we look at it from the point of view of the states' interactions, this is what you are going to see. But if you look at it from the rapid spread and engagements among people and cultures, you will see different things in terms of the unity of ideas, the unity of taste, the unity of music, the unity of the wide range in the area of creativity. Whether you move from Ghana to South Africa, you are going to find the uniting element in that creativity. How we tap into that creativity in relation to what Afro-Futurists are saying is one of what we have to work on. And Maluleke makes the point that this divide and rule continues to work, and that Africans are facilitators as agents. In all forms of encounter, you are going to get that. You are going to get issues around the members of your own citizens facilitating that domination. Flambeau asked the point, suppose we are able to, instead of selling those resources, promoting internal distribution, exchanging them among ourselves, converting our raw materials to finished products. I don't see any disagreement with this. And that form of empowerment will represent collective progress and collective attributes. It's a huge continent. It's a huge continent. Cameroon alone can feed the entire West Africa. So as part of the project of this empowerment, enlargement in the scale of production and distribution will also be a positive way of meeting some of these development challenges. I apologize that my voice is fading. Too many travels.
Fine, thank you, Professor. Any other comments?
Is there a distinction between Afro-Futurism and Afropolitanism, or then the same? Is it that they are against Afrocentric perspective of Pan-Africanism? That against is the central platform of my argument, that I don't see it as against. I'm trying to challenge a certain set of literature that is saying they are against, because I'm arguing that you can fuse them, you can connect them. And that's why I call one setting the stage and another advancing that stage. Some people make distinction between Afro-Puritanism and Afro-Futurism. In the literature, some of those distinctions can be clearer. And some are saying that they can be blended in terms of, and then they had a third concept, cosmopolitanism. All of them share many things in common. And this is the way I tend to present it, that the paradigms of the earlier movements, we are no longer obsessed with them and using them. The paradigm of these new theories is how they define who an African is, how they define Blackness. And they are very welcoming. They are more welcoming than Senghor, for instance, in saying that you don't even have to be an African before you can participate in an Afro-Futurism project. That is an argument that earlier movements will not endorse. But do we have parallels in terms of saying you can be welcomed into an African liberationist ideologies? Yes. Without being an African? Yes. Without being Black? Yes. You find it in literature generated from South Africa. You find it in arguments around race and cosmopolitanism. And one of the organic intellectuals, which is not connected to this literature, is Ahmad Bamba. Ahmad Bamba argued that you can be a Muslim without being an Afro-Arab. You can be a Muslim without accepting Arabism. And in creating the Murid movement, very unique, he advanced yet another argument. Irrespective of your language, if you can speak Wolof, you automatically will gain entrance to many of his positions, and you can be a Murid. And he extended that argument further, that your behavior, your lifestyle, they will not use it to stop you from being a Murid. If the Orthodox Islam argues that your religion is not complete without going on the pilgrimage, Ahmad Bamba made it optional. And Chuba, where he was buried, subsequently becomes the third largest pilgrimage center in the world. So, depending on how you shift the arguments and where you draw the data from, as you put this question of difference, you can see the difference if you are looking for it, and you can see similarities if you are looking for it. And what I've done is looking for these similarities in terms of the continuity in context, in ideologies, self-expression, what they are trying to do with that literature, and what they're trying to do with those ideas, grounded in hope and future development. If Du Bois were to wake up today, he will have minimal disagreement with Afro-Futurism. He may express some doubts, but is going to agree with many of these points.
Professor, if
There's
you can
another
take,
question. There's another question.
yes, if you can take just a question from
Olayombo, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
Olayombo, then we can
Yes,
go back.
sir. Thank you. I was actually typing and then I wasn't done.
Please go ahead, Olayombo.
Okay, I can just explain. So I was trying to say that Pan-Africanism attempts to create a sense of collaboration amongst all people of African descent, as Professor Falola already explained to us. But there has been some clear distinction between the definitions of Afro-Futurism and African Futurism, of which Nnedi Okorafor strongly delineates. And what ties Afro-Futurism and African Futurism together is that they both tell possible futuristic narratives of African people, but one pulls from the diaspora, that is, Afro-Futurism pulls its own artifacts or narratives from the diaspora, and then the other tells the stories of Africans living on the African continent. And so how does Pan-Africanism cater for both definitions?
Okay, bear in mind the context. So, colonial Africa seeking liberation from European domination. Black people in the US, Jamaica, Europe, seeking an end to discrimination, in which they fuse of them. But with a thread around domination, which some of these questions have posed, with a thread around retarded development. The trope outside of Africa was a trope of alienation. And we cannot emphasize this point enough. If you look at the earlier literature generated along the line you frame your question, what they saw was alienation. So if you were to read my Odyssey by Azikwe, it was grounded in how is living Africa produced tremendous alienation. And then you see a trope of the primitive in their own argument. The trope of racism characterizing how their identity was defined. Fast forward. Go to North Paris, we have been many times. Go to Harlem. When you are in London, go to Peckham, Houston, Little Lagos, Los Angeles, Little Ghana. These clusters were not there when Du Bois was writing. They were not there when Garvey was writing. I can argue that many of these ideas of cosmopolitanism, Afro-Futurism, would not have existed without those clusters, without a large number of voluntary immigrants. So as we map the flow of Africans to the West, we see different characterization of the ideologies that emanate from those writings. the African American identity that we talk about, when Blackness is homogenized in the literature, they draw the evidence and conclusions from the diaspora of slavery. That's where they draw their conclusion. Consequently, they talk about freedom narratives, Equano and others. And in some departments, even in the European American Academy, that is where they stop the teaching. That's where they stop. They hardly teach the diaspora of colonization. Indeed, you are not likely to find major books that have been written on that. In that diaspora of colonization, you have the father of the current vice president, an economist who came from Jamaica. You have the father of Obama, a Kenyan. That diaspora of colonization, the literature that it produced, we generally connect it to the civil rights movement and to Pan-Africanism. And then you have the migration of structural adjustments. Millions from the 80s. We have not been teaching them, but it's that diaspora of the African conditions that produce these new theoretical templates. Cosmopolitanism, Afro-Futurism. You have to link them to migrations and the waves of migrations. So there is no way the idea of science fiction will have occurred to an earlier generation. It will not have occurred to the diaspora of slavery. So we have to successfully track wave of migration to wave of ideas and see how a generation has constructed the theories to imagine itself. That's one element. The second element is the argument on agency. In presenting from the European American intellectuals this migration, they do not attribute to them sufficient agency with respect to their contributions. So you have the Eric Williams idea, very dominant idea with respect to that diaspora of slavery, crediting them for consequential in the emergence of capitalism and the building of the Industrial Revolution. Then if we fast forward to these new generations and their theories, notice that these are theories of self-assertion, theories of empowerment, theories saying we are not alienated beings. And if you look at the overall political consequences of these ideas, you see it in the emergence of Trump. You see it in conservative movements, political parties in Europe. And you see the various contradictions in the arguments. On the one hand, you are saying Africa is not important to you. On the other hand, your dominant political philosophy and the policies around those philosophy are driven by Africans and Asia. You cannot understand Brexit without understanding Peckham and Indians in Britain. It's going to, because it's a reaction to them. Neither can you understand Trump without understanding African and Mexican immigrants in the US, in which new forms of fundamentalist nationalism are driven by those that they ignore and those that they assume to be incapable and those whose agency has been erased. So you find how three interrelated clusters of ideas, massive migrations, voluntary, the insertion of these voluntary migrants into key areas of modernities. And now, as it become inserted, you can now produce Taye Selassie or produce Asha or produce new thinkers in terms of how they imagine the world. But as they imagine the world, they are not just hybridizing themselves, but they're interacting with others in a way in which thousands and thousands of Africans, their relationship are with white people, with Asian people, so that if people like Nkrumah and Azikiwe were essentially just relating to Black people and Blyden relating to just Black people, these new theoreticians are relating to peoples of other races, and it's going to affect the way they formulated these ideas. Some people pose the question, why is Du Bois more successful than Garvey? Garvey was a fundamentalist in terms of saying Black should only relate to Black people. Du Bois said, no, you can relate to Jewish people, you can relate to white people, and you see how their strategies are structured by that. Without understanding the lifestyles, the interactions of these younger generations, their theories will be difficult to fully understand. And the way we do the comparison in which we create divisions between the past and the present, many will see it that way.
Thank you very much. Prof. There is a question in the chat from Wangui, who asked whether you think that there have been moments of continuities, discontinuities, or discontinuities of Afro-futuristic past and present, and how can the philosophical concept of futurism in general, I'm trying to read here what we have, but it is a question there from Wangui, whether you think there have been moments of continuities or discontinuities of
yeah. Thank you. So it depends on how you frame the history itself. And the framing of that history will lead you to multiple conclusions. So if you frame a past movement as dead, if you say negritude is dead, then you are not going to see continuities, because what you are going to see will be discontinuities. If you frame Pan-Africanism as dead, you're not going to see continuity. You will see the discontinuities. What I've done in this lecture is to take a position. I won't see them as dead. I will see them as creating foundational thought, as creating a set of ideas to draw from. And as I frame my own argument, I said, okay, what is the end product that they're looking for? So if what you are looking for is transformation. And I take the trope of transformation. My argument would be that if Biden is talking about transformation of Africa, and Selassie is talking about the transformation of Africa, why don't we see continuity in that? If Marcus Garvey is talking about discrimination, talking about Back to Africa movement, you can say the new theorists are not saying everybody should go back to Africa, like Garvey, but they're still talking about discrimination. They're still talking about racism. And to that extent, my argument is that we can identify what they're talking about and see a continuity in it. And we have to allow various opinions to flourish and antagonize one another. If they antagonize one another, we all benefit from it. Alternative opinions and conclusions, in my opinion, should be promoted. If somebody tells me he doesn't see the connection between Nkrumah and Afro-Futurists, I may argue with them. But in that argument, it does not mean I won't still see the connection. Because if you read the speeches that Kwame Nkrumah made on building a nuclear power, in some ways it's similar to this science fiction. In the final analysis, no nuclear power emerged, and Ghana did not become a nuclear power, but he imagined it. He imagined it. If I tell you many aspects of what you call juju, that somebody can hit you with a machete, there will be no blood, there will be no cut. I can do parallel with science fiction. Black Panther, the invention, technological invention that will uplift Africa, is a form of juju if you see it as a continuity. But if you don't see it as a continuity, it's a step in the ultimate technological advancement. And you disconnect both ideas depending on how you want to frame your arguments.
Thank you, Professor, for that answer. As we move towards conclusion, there is another question from the chat from CNA, and the question is, how long would it take for Africans, the leadership in particular, to commonly define the continent's unity?
Defined it.
Its future. Yeah.
No, they've defined it. I think is to be fair to African Union, is Agenda 2063 has answered this question, which is signposts. I've had the privilege of working with that agenda, of being invited to evaluate it. But you see, the very fact that you sit down and you say some years ago, I want to see Africa in how it looks like in 2063, is futuristic. So what it does is to say, this is not scientific imagination. This is saying that these imaginations are translatable. That's what they have done. Are they going to achieve it? You and I, we don't know that. And you see my critique of science fiction as well. Is it achievable? We hope that it's achievable, but we cannot promise it. And I made a point that they will be criticized not now, in years ahead, that all these your imaginations, a younger generation will ask them, how come they don't come to pass? What is delaying them? How come they don't come to pass? A previous generation challenged Senghor, challenged Du Bois, challenged Nkrumah, that the development you promised us didn't come. So a generation will formulate its ideas, its premises, its hope, and another generation will challenge it. That is normal. There's nothing wrong with that, because each generation will be phased out. It's not a question of choice. It's just a question of nature and atrophy. And as we are being phased out, a new generation, not dismissive, but we query our cumulative achievements. And in doing this, Africa is not peculiar. Africa is not peculiar. You find it in the lineage of European philosophers, establishing serious doubts and engaging with the works of previous generations and their philosophy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Any questions, colleagues? We are left with a few minutes. Maybe I should hand it to you, Sabelo or Robert.
Well,
if there are no questions, Robert, you can relieve the Prof. I think he has shared with us a lot. And thank you so much, Prof, for gracing our event. And Robert, you can close it.
and thank you very much. The audience is impressive.
Yeah.
For a Thursday evening, very impressive. Very great. I'm tired, but I was able to survive it.
Indeed.
Yes, thank you very much, Prof, for this very impressive presentation and the discussion with the audience. I think if there's no other question, I think we can close the session now. So thank you. Thank you to all of you for participating. And Sabelo, when will we have our next lecture in this series?
Thank you for the lecture, Prof.
I'm not sure.
I think the next one is on the 21st of July. It is, the title is Theorizing Present Struggle. That is the title of the next lecture on the 21st of July. At 5 o'clock, well, South African time, it is at 5 o'clock. Yes, but I know we come from different time zones, but the next one is on the 21st of July.
So everybody is warmly invited to attend
Yes.
to the next session as well. So
Yes.
thank you very much. Have a nice evening.
Thank you very much, Prof. Thank you, Sabelo. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
Okay.